أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum. My good friends, I'm going to raise a topic that is used to insult and to degrade the standing of not only the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad alayhi salam, but also Islam in general, and that is the marriage of the Prophet to a child bride of 6 or 7 years old, Aisha. And you know what? Muslims have a problem with this position, with this historical report or reported fact of history, which I don't regard as a fact. In that they have a choice here. Either they have to concede that the books are correct, the holy books of Islam outside of the Quran, the Hadith books, Bukhari, etc., are all authentic, and that the Prophet did indeed, as these books report, did in fact marry a child and went to bed and consummated a marriage with a 9-year-old child. I want you to just think of a 9-year-old in your family. Think of a 9-year-old child. Think of any 9-year-old. Go to your school. Go to your children's school and look at the 9-year-olds. These are grade 3 children, right? So what the Muslims do is they have to maintain the veracity or the authenticity or the reliability of the books outside of the Quran, Bukhari, Muslim, all the other books, which state that the Prophet married a 7-year-old. Some of them state it was a 6-year-old. Or they could go the other route. They could say that it was a lie, and then they have to concede that the books are not authentic and reliable. Remember, this is a story that is completely outside of the Quran. The Quran does not touch on this particular topic. So what do the Muslims do? What they did, in fact, is they go and they preserve their books, Bukhari, etc. They say their books are fine, there's nothing wrong with their books. But the Prophet, in fact, married a 7-year-old. And then you ask them, will you marry a 7-year-old? And they'll come up with all sorts of arguments. Now, the sad thing is they then start inventing arguments and positions to justify that. And in no way do they clear the image or the position of the Prophet. In fact, they are prepared to drown with their Prophet, to sacrifice their Prophet, and to sacrifice an entire community. And I want to point you to the arguments, the flimsy arguments. Now, first of all, they will use arguments such as that a 7-year-old could be quite mature. A 9-year-old could be quite developed. And in those days, 9-year-olds were more advanced. This is nonsense, my dear friends. We're talking 1400 years ago. There is no place, there is no way in which evolution can play out over 14 centuries. Evolution, and I do concede much of the ideas like natural selection, survival of the fittest, not everything, but there are many aspects of evolution, and I do believe evolution is a God-directed process. It's a method of creation used by our Lord. But these Muslims are using arguments, and I want to show you one of the arguments that one particular guy uses. Now, this guy is called Daniel Hakikachu. He's been a Shia, then he became a Sunni, now he's like flirting with Salafism. I put him in the camp of the new generation of cowboy Salafis. You know, the guys that sport an American accent, the accent that you hear in the cowboy movies, but promoting antiquated, concocted ideas about Islam. And unfortunately, ideas that are mixed with conjecture, hadiths, and all sorts of nonsense, mixed with some truths. Now, this guy's particular angle is he's got a good grip on sort of Western argumentation and scientific reasoning. And he employs it, using statistics, using averages, and so on. And I'm not intimidated because, as you know, I'm a statistics person myself. I'm a graduate from the School of Statistics. And so, but he's very powerful with quoting averages and figures and standard deviations and stuff. And that is like his thing. And he's also very big into social science and quoting trends and in populations, etc. And his Islam is kind of Baptist Islam, it's like an Islam mixed with Southern Baptism. So in other words, a very negative position. The thrust of his Islam is basically he's at war with the lesbians and the gays and all these things that upset Southern Baptists. And that's basically the thrust of his position. And he comes up with a response to the story that the Prophet married a child. Now just listen to his response.
So we'll point to this, the age of Aisha and her marriage to the Prophet ﷺ. So I think that this is very easily addressed, and I would have to, create a whole new video to just focus on this to give all the details. But I just want to mention a few points. First of all, this was a common practice in every culture, every pre-industrial, pre-modern culture. This was very common.
To marry children of 7 years old and to marry 9-year-old, to sleep with 9-year-olds, there's absolutely no basis for making that statement. Abu Bakr didn't marry a 9-year-old. Umar didn't marry a 9-year-old. Sayyidina Ali didn't marry none of the other. There's no story of any other Sahabi in the time of the Prophet marrying a 7-year-old. So that's a lie. And I think he knows he's lying.
Practice. And so no one ever pointed this marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Aisha radiallahu anha as something immoral or something that was problematic. And you have to really understand what the practice really is, okay, of marrying, of a man, older man marrying or having sex with a 9-year-old or 10-year-old prepubescent girl. And the thing is that in the vast majority of history,
Okay, so he's clearly now, you can see, he's taking the position because he's committed to his books. He's not committed to reality, to truth. He's committed to his holy books, Bukhari, etc. And he's now going to defend, he's going to try to invent arguments and historical proofs which are lies. You see, we should not be producing arguments for Muslims, my dear friends. I want you to please make a note of this important point, that you and I are not here to produce arguments for Muslims. We are here to produce arguments for mankind, for humanity. And the test of our arguments should be whether a non-Muslim buys it. Not whether Muslims buy it. You see, what you are doing is you're inventing excuses for Muslims. And excuses are a dime a dozen. You can make excuses up all day long. But to invent cogent, convincing proofs and arguments, that you can only test with people who are indifferent to Islam or to Muslim affairs. And this guy is producing excuses now. These are not arguments. And they will fly, but only with Muslims. Listen to the argument.
Expectancy was relatively low. Infant mortality was considerably high. And so therefore it was necessary to use the extent of the fertility window for reproduction. What do I mean by fertility window? Women have only a certain number of years where they can have children and reproduce. And it can start as early as 9 years old, 8 years old, and extends to about mid-30s or up to 40. So given the high mortality rate, the high infant mortality rate, the low life expectancy, it's important to use that in the entirety of.
Okay, so then what he's saying is that because there was a high mortality rate, and as you can see, I pointed out to you earlier, he's going to bamboozle you with this type of facts and figures. But he's talking nonsense. In fact, there's no basis for what he's saying now, is that a high mortality rate is ameliorated by marrying women who are children or younger. Just because a boy can produce semen at the age of 14, does that mean that boys of 14 should be having children? At any time in history, that is not known to have happened. There's always been, and I will point you out after showing this. I'm going to point you to the real story, because I'm not here just to criticize. I want to point you to the correct understanding of this problem, and I'm going to show you what really is the explanation for this accusation that the Prophet married a 7-year-old and slept with a 9-year-old. But listen to this guy's silly story that he made up, I think.
That window. And what psychologists say today, evolutionary psychologists, say that this practice is actually evolutionarily adaptive. Okay,
this guy doesn't believe in evolution, right?
This is something that is adaptive if we consider Darwinian evolution. I don't accept Darwinian.
I don't accept Darwinian evolution, but so why are you incorporating it as a proof?
Evolution, that's a whole different topic. But for some of these atheists who do accept evolution, then this is something that was practiced and it was considered evolutionarily adaptive. And there's a strong moral reason for it as well, because when you have a society where all of labor is manpower, and in fact your survival as a people, as a family, as a village, as a nation depends on your numbers, right? Do you have enough people to sustain the amount of labor that's required to survive pre-industrial times? Do you have enough children who can fight if there are invaders, who can defend your tribe, defend your city, so forth? Then it becomes very important to make sure that you have enough children. And if you are waiting...
Listen to this guy now. This guy is throwing out a massive amount of nonsense here. I mean, if you could have a sewage pipe spurting out garbage, it wouldn't be as dangerous as this guy. Because the Prophet married Aisha, they never even had one child together. So this whole idea of children and multiplying, you know what, as far as I know, the friends of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, had 4 children, I think, in total. And he had those children when he was young. Sayyidina Ali had 4 children, I think, or 5 children. Sayyidina Umar, I don't even know, I think a few children. You know, these people had few children. They never had 10 or 12 or 15 children. What he's going on and on about here, his whole story is simply a fabricated load of nonsense just to exonerate the books of Islam. And I'm going to do something now. I'm going to show you the truth about the Prophet marrying a 6 or 7-year-old child and sleeping, having sex with a 9-year-old child. And every time I say that, you must feel cringe. You must feel that cringe, because that's what I feel. You must feel that cringe, and you must hate the people who spread this cringeworthy nonsense. So now I'm going to show you an argument or the story as it is, and you can tell me what makes more sense, this guy spewing all this garbage or what I'm going to show you now. Take a look at this. So let us start with the assumption that the books, the Hadith books, are not sacred and that they could be wrong. And let us start from the assumption that what we find to be abhorrent, in other words, having relations of a sexual nature with a child of 9 years old, we find it disgusting and repugnant. Let's start with those two assumptions. In other words, our own natural inclination and not applying or affording sacred value to any of these books. And then let us proceed with looking at this problem. Now, the books that are making this claim there are more Tabari, Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Sa'd, but there's also Dhahabi, there's Hajar Asqalani, there's Bukhari. So I'll just put a few there, but there are actually more. But it will come out as we proceed through this now. Now, let me first go to the first one, and that is Tabari. In Tabari, he claims in his book the following. The Prophet married a 7-year-old child in 620 CE, slept with her in 623, right? That is the claim generally. So, what we know, what Tabari also says, and what is common knowledge, is that Aisha is the child. The child is Abu Bakr's daughter. The child that the Prophet married is the daughter of Abu Bakr. And what Tabari also states is that all 4 Abu Bakr's children were born before the Prophet's mission started. Right? That means Aisha was born before 610, which is commonly known as the year in which the mission of Muhammad alayhi salam started. So all 4 children, Tabaris, were born before 610. That means if you are just simply looking at Tabari's work, all his facts that he are producing and reporting, then Aisha is the daughter of Abu Bakr. All Abu Bakr's children were born before the mission of the Prophet, before 610. Then by that alone, that means she was not 9 in 623 or 620, but she was in fact 9. She was 15 years old at the time of consummation. So I'm not saying that she was 15. All I'm saying here is that Tabari is contradicting himself. That's the only deduction I make here. Right, let's just move on. Already there's a contradiction with one of the top books that Muslims base their history on. Ibn Hajar, another hadith god man, says in his book Al-Isaba, Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, was born when the Kaaba was busy being rebuilt, when the Prophet was 35. That's reported in Ibn Hajar's book, Al-Isaba. Now, Ibn Hajar is a giant. He's a giant. Hadith culture, hadith literature, it rests on giants like Ibn Hajar. If you take Ibn Hajar away, then the whole idea of ilmul rijal, the classification of the reliability of companions almost falls away. Now he states, this giant says that Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, was born when the Kaaba was rebuilt, when the Prophet was 35. The same Ibn Hajar also says in his book that Fatima was 5 years older than Aisha, right? So here's another deduction. Aisha was 40 years younger than the Prophet. That's what we deduce, right? The Prophet was 35 when Fatima was born. Fatima is 5 years older than Aisha. The Prophet was 40 years younger. You just need simple mathematics here. 40 years younger than the Prophet. Deduction 2, Aisha was 12 years at the time of the marriage and 15 years at the time of consummation. But I'm not making that deduction. I'm again making the deduction that the hadith man God Ibn Hajar is fallible, unreliable. Next proof. Zahabi, another giant. But also with him here in this particular argument, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Hajar again, stating, Aisha had a sister named Asma, who is known to have been 10 years older than Aisha. Right, so Asma, the oldest sister of Aisha, is recognized in these books. Older, 10 years older. Recognized by Ibn Kathir, recognized by Zahabi, recognized by many historians, put Asma 10 years older than Aisha. Those same books say that Asma was alive when her own son was killed in 693 Common Era, at which time she was known to have been 100 years old. Ibn Kathir. So follow the argument, or you can press replay. Asma was alive when her son was killed in 693, and she is known to have been 100 years old when she died that same year when her son was killed. So Ibn Hajar confirms this fact. Deduction 1. If Asma was 100 years old in 693, then she was 27 or 28 when her sister got married. When her sister Aisha got married, 10 years younger than her, commonly known, in 693, then she was 27 or 28 in the year 620 when her sister got married. Deduction 2, Aisha was 17 or 18 at the time of the marriage. Deduction 3, Ibn Hajar is unreliable and the books of history are contradictory. Again, my friends, unfortunately, we have to find in favor of the Prophet and against the so-called holy books. Let us come to the holiest of all holy cows, Bukhari. Now Bukhari states, and he quotes Aisha stating, she was a maiden, she was a damsel, a young woman, in Arabic a Jariya, when Surah Qamar was revealed. Surah Qamar is, I think, the 58th or 59th verse in the Holy Quran. And we all know when, it's commonly known when that verse was revealed. Surah Qamar is known to have been revealed 8 years before the Hijrah in 614. Right, so the deduction is if Aisha was already a maiden in 614, which as you can see is 7 years, 8 years before the marriage, 6 years before the marriage, 7 years before the marriage. If she was already a maiden 7 years before the marriage, then she could not have been 7 at the time of the marriage. The deduction is she was 17 or 18 at the time of the marriage. And the real deduction is that Bukhari is really not reliable. Now, my friends, you know what these guys that I've shown you earlier, what they are unprepared to concede, is that the books that the Sunni religion or Islam is built on are unreliable, are fraught with errors and contradictions. And we know what the Quran says about divine books and contradictions. We know what the Quran says. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Do they not consider the Quran with care? Had it been from other than Allah, they would surely have found therein much discrepancy. Much discrepancy. And so I point you to this verse, my dear friends. And the Hadith books are not from Allah. They are the fallible work of men, and we cannot assume these books to be the gospel truth and to trust 100% what they say. But also these modern day cowboys that have taken it upon themselves to defend those books with lies and contradictions. We have to be more fearful of them because they are not bringing you any solutions. They are trying to impose and reinforce and reassure you of the lies. While we have to move on, my brothers and sisters, we have to look afresh at our history, at our sources, at the things and the books and the people that we depend on. And that is the only way we will move our deen forward. Just to close off with, I want to show you a verse from the Quran, because at the end of the day, the Quran has a word on the, has maybe something to say on this matter. You know, you are claiming that a child of 7 years old underwent a nikah, an aqdul nikah. Now, you know, in Arabic, the word aqd means a contract. A contract is an agreement, and Islam, we know that in Islam, marriage is a contract. It is a contract, and it has to be signed between two consenting human beings, between consenting adults. The male and the female must give consent to this nikah to take place. What does the Quran say about nikah and the standing or the position of the two parties? Look at this verse here, where Allah says in Surah 5, verse 6, and this one should actually blow away any uncertainty in this matter of whether the Prophet married a child. It is completely illegal, illegitimate in terms of our holy book to marry a child, because a child is not fit to sign a contract. Why is a child not fit to sign a contract? Because the child does not have the clear understanding of what is in their interest and what is not in their long-term interest. The child is focused on the immediate, on the now. And so this verse spells it out very clearly to anyone who is still in doubt about whether the Prophet married a child. Look at this verse here. The verse says, make trial of orphans until they reach the age of marriage. In other words, there is an age of marriage. Right, now it goes on to say, what is the age of marriage? If you find sound judgment in them. If you find sound judgment in them. And we know that sound judgment is the ability to distinguish short-term and long-term pros and cons, or benefits and harms that are possible. Release their property to them, but consume it not wastefully, nor in haste against their growing up. And so I think just those few lines, we don't have to look at the whole verse. Make trial of orphans until they reach the age of marriage, either balagh nikah, when they reach the age of marriage, if you find sound judgment in them. And we know what sound judgment. If you have a child, you know what is sound judgment. A child of 7 does not have sound judgment. And from the books, from what we've read, from our own natural inclination, the way you feel, it is abhorrent to think of marrying a 7-year-old and getting into bed with a 9-year-old in the wrong way, in a sexual way. And so every fiber of your being is rejecting that, but people are telling you, you need to believe the books, not your natural instinct. And we are here, I'm here to tell you, your natural instinct is an excellent guide to what is good most of the time, 90% of the time. And let us use that instinct here to repel and reject and to identify the falsehood spreaders and to get back to our trustworthy, reliable, sacred text, which is the Quran. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.